Before we get started, I want to introduce myself. And I have, just in honor of tonight's topic, I was doing a little self-reflection today, thinking a little bit about life purpose. And that's always been something since I was a little girl that has been important to me to feel like I was making a difference. And I felt like I had a mission when I remember being 4 and feeling like I had a mission on this planet. So I want to share with you that as the founder of Botanic Wise, I see myself as a weaver of people, plants, and possibility. I believe that learning is most alive when it's shared, rooted in relationship, and guided by curiosity. I have created this community space here where herbal wisdom can unfold naturally, where teachers, students, and plants all have a voice in the conversation. So I'm proud that Botanic Wise offers more than just classes and information. It's a living, breathing community grounded in connection, reciprocity, and practical healing wisdom. And I'm grateful to Abby, who is behind the scenes here, and she's always present with us, working behind the scenes to keep things running smoothly. Please feel free to reach out to her in the chat or via email, botanicwise@gmail.com. If you have any questions or need support accessing the replay, there's always questions, and she knows it all, and I don't. So I just also want to review why we're here tonight. Of course, we're here to listen to our topic, listening and learning from plants, exploring how they can lead us through powerful storytelling, and how our relationship with herbs opens a cycle of healing and creativity. That all being said, let's move on to introduce our special guest, Guido Masé. Guido is an herbalist, author, teacher, and devoted garden steward. His work combines therapeutic herbalism and the rich, intricate pharmacology of plants and mushrooms. A founder of the Vermont Center for Integrative Herbalism, he continues to shape herbalism as a principal scientist and head formulator at Traditional Medicinal's tea company. But what people remember most about Guido isn't just what he knows, it's how he shares it. In the Botanic Wise community, you'll hear it again and again. Guido has a gift for taking the complex and making it feel like a conversation you didn't know you were ready for. So true. He builds quiet bridges between science and spirit, offering knowledge that doesn't just inform, it nourishes, connecting personal healing with something larger, more communal, and very much alive. So thank you, Guido.
Thanks, Karis. That was such a lovely introduction. And I also really appreciate how you framed your mission and the mission of the Botanic Wise community, this idea of health and creativity coming through interplay and through the building of relationships and through the sharing of stories. I want to talk a little bit about that with you all this evening, and really try and dive into, I'm just a silly human being, and I have grand ideas in my head and have always had them since I was a little kid. I love that. But it's taken plants to remind me and really teach me that A, I'm not in charge at all, and that B, a lot of the times letting plants take the lead helps me achieve way better outcomes than if I try and like puzzle it out myself. And this is probably all very familiar and sort of as I talk about some of what has been really a nourishing and inspiring journey for me with herbs, I'm sure that you all will be like, oh my goodness, of course. And you will feel points of resonance in your own story because we're herbalists. And that's why I'm really grateful to be here. I've talked about some of these concepts in the herbal products industry. I've talked about it particularly in the context of the trade in medicinal plants around the world, which is huge, big business, you all, and has some very strange and interesting sort of energetics and braids that flow through it. And it's sometimes hard to get traction with these concepts that, like, nature has a living mind. Plants are alive, participatory, curious beings. there is a way to connect with them on their own terms rather than ours. All of that probably feels very familiar and comfortable to you, but believe me, in the general Western world, those are still pretty bizarre concepts. And what I've found is that it's actually difficult to disentangle my training, so to speak, how I've been brought up in a Western context. We talk about the unity of sort of flesh and spirit, right? Of mind and body. But when it really comes down to it, at least in myself, I noticed I still behave as if the two were separate a lot of the time. And a lot of people that I encounter in my life behave as if the two were separate. I'm here partly this evening to let you know they aren't at all, right? Which of course you know, but also that modern science, even the philosophy of healthcare, they're starting to come around. And I think the reason is that we're really reaching a limit to what the human brain, mind, consciousness can do on its own. We're trying, right? And you see this in the herbal products industry. You see it in healthcare. And we keep running up against this sort of limit of complexity and intractability, especially with things like chronic disease, right? I really humbly propose that herbalism offers something that is really unique, which is a very well thought out, super grounded and practical technology for attuning to this sort of universal creative mind process that exists in nature, in our planet, and beyond. It exists deep inside us, in our individual cells as they learn and adapt and grow. It exists in us as a whole being, in our communities, which is why I loved that sort of touchstone of the Botanic Wise community and the process of relationship building that exists there. And it exists in our culture, in our systems of medicine and care, and beyond that in our ecologies and the biosphere and beyond. So tonight I want to go over some key and I think really beautiful insights from science that really ask us to reframe how we think about our own agency, where our thoughts come from, where our behaviors come from, and also think about plants not as even resources or tools or substances we can use for healing, but rather as, I would say, directors, companions, but wiser than we are, and masterful modifiers of process and trainers of habit. Plants literally make soil. They create community in the ecological system of the world. I believe one of the things that herbalism can offer in the crazy times we're living in is a very well thought out process for how to bring the tonifying, balancing, creativity enhancing power of plants into our individual lives. So I've been really focused on herbalism not as a cure for what ails you, even though it is, but herbalism as a process of attunement that helps us tell the story of an evolving world hand in hand with that world. So I want to introduce a little bit of that. I want to introduce you to this idea of a gift cycle, which, if you haven't heard me talk about that before, is sort of the way I summarize this process, and introduce you a little bit to some of how that shows up for me in herbalism. We'll hopefully be able to end with a little bit of reflection and questions. I'd love to hear what your take is, right, on some of these ideas and how it shows up in your life. And then we'll see where it takes us from there. So let me start by just sharing a few slides. And we'll have this on for a little bit, but not forever, hopefully. So I talk about the word mind, and it's not my favorite word, but this idea of sort of mind, thought, spirit, the intangible. Um, I use the word mind as a placeholder for that. So forgive me, it doesn't really capture everything, but it's a useful shorthand for me. So I want to explore the mind of herbs and not just the mind of an individual plant or remedy, but more writ large. And how does that mind interface with our minds? Are they even separate? What are we talking about? So that's why I title this way. But to get us started, I want to go back to what have been some really powerful experiences for me in clinic and just kind of ask you to think about if you've had a relationship with a human being and you've, turned them onto a plant and you've seen it make an impact in their life. One of the things that I've found, and I've spoken to other clinicians like acupuncturists or massage therapists and other body workers too, they tell me my work is great and I'll like fix this sort of structural misalignment in a person or I'll fix this like pattern of imbalance. But then I really love to be able to send them home with herbs because as they make that tea or as they take that tincture or make that powdered remedy, the herbs reinforce what I did in the office, right? That structural realignment can be reinforced by an herb taken at home. And as an herbalist, of course, I saw this a lot, but I also would see something else happen in clinic all the time, right? And this might be something that you all have noticed too. So I might be talking about like astringency or the need to sort of shore up tissue because a person feels very boggy, right? They're showing signs of swelling. They're showing some signs of moisture trapped in their tissue and stagnation. So I'm thinking astringency, and then all of a sudden the alder will come up. And I'll just think of alder leaves and alder buds, and I'll get kind of taken to this swampy places in Vermont where we can find alder. And I'll think about this story that I heard growing up, kind of a grim story about this kid who hides in a tree and then watches this group of sort of sorcerers cut up this person and throw it into a big vat and like trying to like extract the power from this person and this kid like drops a single alder cone into that vat and all of a sudden the person springs back up knit back together even though they had been chopped up and sort of vanquishes the sorcerers and ascends to the throne and is this benevolent prince that helps everyone. So I think about this story about alder stitching things together. I have this vision about the swamp. It really resonates with this sense I had as a clinician in the office that this person's tissue is super boggy, and it all locks together for me. And I'm like, let me tell you about alder. I would like to give you a little bit of alder bark powder to put into your preparation. And how does that sound to you? And can I tell you this story about where alder grows in the swampy places of Vermont and how it feels when you chew the bark? Can I tell you this story that I heard as a little kid? Anyway, you might also, I might be talking to a person about blood flow and or I might notice some signs either in their pulse showing that there's a little bit of constriction or on their tongue showing that there's a little bit of stagnation and I might be thinking about different ways of approaching it and all of a sudden yarrow comes, right? I'm sure that you all have had an experience like this where the sort of connection you have to a plant shows up in clinic. And the way it does for me is sometimes an image, sometimes a place where the plant grows, and sometimes a story, right? That I heard tell about that plant that really cemented a specific aspect of its power to me. One of the things I love about yarrow is an old story about sort of that I first heard from Leslie Tierra actually about the changeability of yarrow's colors. And you can see her pink or red or white or sometimes even a little bit blushing golden in a field. That changing of colors being connected to a person's changeability and desire to express different facets of themselves. And so maybe that person that I'm looking at in clinic who shows a little bit of signs of stagnation and needs a little movement for their blood, I'm also feeling that there's pieces of themselves that they're not getting to express, that they're not truly getting to shine with all their colors. And all of a sudden, as all this comes together, yarrow holds the space for me. So whether it's alder or yarrow or you name it, right? How many times have I really felt that a person needed to encounter plants in their dreams and I wanted to turn them on to an herb like wormwood or mugwort or other of these silvery artemisias? These connections happen to us as herbalists. And we don't necessarily know exactly where they're coming from. Certainly, our practice our time spent in nature, our time spent with plants, even our time spent with books and with each other talking about plants, all of that feeds into it, right? But ultimately, when yarrow comes to me or wormwood comes to me, and I think about the places where I've encountered these amazing allies, I can't help but think that there's something beyond just what I've learned that is coming through, partly because I'm an herbalist and I'm open to these possibilities. So, coming down to it, I feel that the clinical encounter itself, when you meet a person and even you just listen to them, telling you about what is in their heart, what is concerning for them, what is inspiring for them, what they need, even that opening of you being there to hear and listen, that is a huge healing experience, right? And I think a big part of being an herbalist is just providing space for people to tell their stories. And then to add our stories as a layer, or I prefer to think of it as another sort of interwoven braid, right? That can then become part of this person's story. And to have the plant be a part of that, and to have people be able to leave with a story about why that plant makes sense to them. And then the physical chemistry of communion, of taking that plant into their body, right? That to me is a powerful, powerful healing experience. But for a long time, I sort of kept the two separate, right? The story that we're telling, the meaning that we're making together with words and maybe images, and then the physical plant that the person is putting in their body. But what I've come to realize, you all, and I don't know, if you've ever felt this, I bet that you have, is that that plant and the chemistry of communion it represents when we take her into our body is actually telling a story too. Maybe not with words the same way we did in the clinical office, but as that plant impacts our senses and as it impacts our cellular machinery and the tissues that those cells make up, it's telling a very profound and powerful story there too. And there's two pieces to that story I've found. One is this very ancient one, right? Where we and plants have been dancing together, where plants have literally shaped us, where the cells and tissues that we have in our body are there because, as animals, we lived in a plant-rich world. And because plants are such incredible storytellers and incredible channels and guides for the creation of environments and the creation of literally animal evolution, we plug into that ancient story when we take plants into our bodies. Our bodies expect and remember that we are part of this really old story that's still being written. And that's the second piece, right? When we turn someone onto a plant and they haven't ever tried wormwood or they haven't ever tried yarrow and they put it into their body, that's a new chapter to this very ancient story and a very new story for that one person. So seeing that, I all of a sudden, as an herbalist, saw myself not as a storyteller and matchmaker anymore, but really as just a translator of the story that plants are telling. And that's now how I see my role, right? It really has taken a lot, and it's still taking a lot for me to be able to fully shift my perspective from that of the human who gets things and makes decisions to more of the human who has this incredible gift as a human, a birthright, to be able to feel the storytelling of plants and participate in the storytelling of plants writ large. I think having this different perspective not only helps me sort of dive into the clinical experience, I think, really quickly, but it also has the potential, in my opinion, to provide a totally new way of looking at some of these difficult problems that we see in our society today, whether it's chronic disease, whether it's difficulty relating to each other because our perspectives appeared so different, whether it's how to handle our extraction of natural resources from the planet, which we're doing a great job with, but which perhaps needs a little bit of a modulatory influence to it And our brains are having a really hard time coming up with that modulatory influence. Spoiler alert, you all, plants know exactly how to do this. They know exactly how to regulate the valve of our sort of childlike excitement about the world so that it doesn't burn out, overtake things, or conversely, sort of peter out and atrophy. So, enough of that. Let me share what I think are some really amazing perspectives from the modern scientific community that give me a lot of hope that what we know as herbalists is really starting to trickle into the academic and scientific consciousness space. So I'll start with this idea. People are into herbs, you all. I don't know if you've noticed this, but people are into herbs. When people connect with plants, it speaks, I think, to something. And I don't really know that anyone fully understands what that is. I'm still trying to figure it out, but it speaks to something really profound. Ethnobotanists and botanists who like to look at this say that we have more than 60,000 different species of medicinal plants in the world. I think that's a crazy number, but I also don't have any way to say whether it's accurate or not. It could be twice that. There's so many species that we have yet to fully understand, right? Still, so many different plants. And without the places where they grow and the people who are connected to them, traditional indigenous knowledge related to these plants, we really don't know whether they're medicinal or not. And if they are medicinal, what that medicine is like. So I want us to remember, first of all, it's not just medicinal plants that exist in the world. It's medicinal plants in places all over the world with people and animals who have a deep connection to them, who understand when the harvest has to happen, how the preparation has to happen. Without that knowledge, we folks who live in these boxes in this part of the world, we would have no way of understanding how to apply these plants as medicine and how to really have them change our lives in these profound ways. So that's really important. At the same time, with all these medicinal plants and with all this interest that's growing in them, what we're finding is that more and more of these plants are facing extinction globally for a range of different factors. And I speak to growers and wild collectors around the world, and they are telling me that it is getting harder and harder and harder for them to do their job, and that the next generation is less and less interested. So not only are we risking sort of medicinal plants and the storehouse of ecological interconnection that they represent, we're also risking the places and people that make that knowledge possible, or at least translatable, right, to us as human beings. So this is paradox that I see. People are really interested, and herbs are growing and growing and growing in the marketplace. It's still growing in double digits. It's remarkable to see. But our day-to-day engagement with living herbs is decreasing. Our day-to-day engagement with forests and gardens, it's decreasing. So the consequences of this disconnect are interesting, right? Because all this commercial pressure for plants exists. People want them, right? And so people are going out there and harvesting them and growing them and putting them in boxes and shipping them around the world. But at the same time, because we're not engaged, other than at the end point when they're all powdered up in a capsule most of the time, biodiversity, habitat loss, and traditional knowledge loss are real concerns. So this interesting paper, right, that is here at the bottom of this slide, was published by a group of researchers in Germany who identified this, right? And they're like, okay, we see that biodiversity is important in our local communities, in our local ecologies. We can't just monocrop corn in agriculture anymore because it's not really super sustainable. Yet at the same time, as we're saying, one of the answers to the biodiversity problem is to bring medicinal plants into people's lives. What we're finding is that people are doing a lot less of that. They're taking pills and extracts, at least in Germany, this is very prevalent, right? But they're not actually gardening or spending time outside. And what they find is that not only does that lead to some of these pressures on plants globally, but it also means that we're not actually improving biodiversity. We're not actually rewilding our cities. We're not actually moving forward with what we know is a whole ecology sort of approach to health and healing, right? You all have heard people talk about this. When you live in a food desert in an urban environment, you are at a huge disadvantage, partly because your environment is not biodiverse. You're not exposed to the same range of options that sort of train your physiology and keep you engaged and keep you healthy. It's not just the lack of food. So upstreaming these ideas of like creating healthy communities always include this idea of like biodiversity enhancement. So the folks who wrote this paper were like, hey, the people who are really into taking herbal products, right, and going to the pharmacy and purchasing these need to also, if we're trying to increase healing and trying to do that in a culture-wide, or in this case, German nation-wide way, we need to actually not just give people herbs, but teach them how to grow those herbs, bring more herbs into local communities and local gardens, and have them actually relate, actually connect, actually get their fingers dirty with this living, growing beings, which we call medicinal plants. Now, to most of you, this would seem like a no-brainer. And we've been recommending like even just growing a little pot of lemon balm on the windowsill for yourself, right? But believe it or not, to many folks who are trying to deal with the problems that our Western culture often has, even in places like Germany, they don't make these connections. There's people thinking about the pharmacology of plants. There's people thinking about sort of rewilding urban spaces and doing urban architecture projects. There's people thinking about sustainable agriculture and biodiversity in agricultural fields. But none of them are trying to put this all together as a comprehensive health promoting strategy. And what I love about this paper is they're saying you can do as much as you want with herbs on an individual basis. But if you don't look at sort of rewilding in the community, and in the urban environment and in the ecology, you're never going to get that deep rebalancing and healing that we need. And so they talk about a social ecology perspective, right? Rather than an individual health perspective. And I love this way of thinking. So this paper comes to us from an amazing researcher. Her name is Chelsea Armstrong, and her team. She works with indigenous populations, particularly out of British Columbia, right? And what I really love about her work is that she is bringing forth the concept over and over again that wild places aren't truly wild in the sense that they've been completely untouched by human hands. This is something I really experienced growing up as a kid in Italy. We would go up to, like, these were my first herbal harvesting experiences. We'd go through the forest, get elderflowers, bilberries, sometimes some mushrooms if we were lucky. Then we'd get up above the tree line, and there's these meadows in the Alps up there. And all you can find there are arnica flowers and gentian and amazing biodiversity of plants. This is where, like, some of my favorite herbs still grow and thrive. And that entire landscape is the way it is because humans have been bringing their cattle up to those high meadows for tens of thousands of years, right? And the interplay of the humans, the cattle, the fertilizer, the plants, that's what creates that environment. And so I go back to this concept, right? Which is what I think those German researchers are trying to do. They're trying to create a person, plant, place nexus, right? Where people are taking plants and they're stewarding plants, and there's more diversity in the ecological space, and that place is sort of becoming and having its own personality now. What Chelsea Armstrong and her team are finding, and this paper right here is particularly about hazelnuts, right? That over 7,000 years ago or more, there's evidence that at these sites where humans inhabited these sort of hazelnut groves, which they were harvesting for food, they were tending the local populations of trees. They were using fire, right, to steward and fertilize. And not only did they get food and did the hazelnuts sort of get spread and tended, but it helped other species too to sort of bring these food sources, tend these food sources, evidence that jay populations were thriving, squirrel populations were thriving, biodiversity overall was thriving, and the sort of personality of the place was deeply tied to this interplay between the plants there and the animals there, including the people. And so I see this in Ireland too, which basically is what it is because of the interconnection between people and plants played out over thousands of years. So the point here, and what Dr. Armstrong does is she'll, for example, participate as an expert witness when indigenous tribes are trying to say, hey, our land management practices are actually really, really sharp and really well thought out. We've been doing it for thousands of years. They encourage sustainability and regeneration in the local environment. We are not sort of harming a wild place. We literally are part of that wild place. It is what it is because we are there. And I just want us to think about that for a second, right? Humans have influence, and we participate, whether we like it or not, in the personality and nature of the ecologies in which we find ourselves. What herbalism has taught me and what plants have taught me is that there's a way to do that mindfully, in partnership with the ecology around us. And there's a way to do that less mindfully, which certainly is something that we have been playing with over the last few hundred years. And I can't blame us. As a species, we're little kids compared to plants. We get excited, we follow our ideas, we play. But as Dr. Armstrong has found, simply because humans exist isn't the problem, right? It's more about how we do things and the process of engagement that is, if you want to call it a problem, that's not a problem, it's just immature, okay? So forever, animals and humans as a kind of animal have participated in the creation and sustenance of wildly biodiverse natural places. And maybe part of that disconnect that the German researchers were finding was that we think we're not actually part of nature. And I just want to push on that button a little bit and say, it doesn't matter what we do or think, we will always be part of nature. And we better act that way, right? Because our choices have profound consequences. I'll tell you, I'm not smart enough to know how to act properly as a human being in this wide world of nature. But if I have plants by my side, I feel more confident that I can act properly. Partly because plants literally direct my mind and my spirit. And that's really what I want to talk about a little more in depth with you all. So, people are super into herbs. I'm seeing interest grow. I'm seeing more and more folks come into herbal clinics, more and more people taking herbal education programs, more and more people buying herbal tea. I think that's great. But could we be missing something in our modern relationship with herbs and herbal medicine? And if so, if we might be missing something, what is that something? This paper is from a Brazilian researcher. Her name is Karen Shiratori. She has worked in cities like Sao Paulo, but that was only the very beginning of her career. She has been working with indigenous Amazonian tribes ever since. A recent paper she wrote called Extra Botanical Capacities, Plant Agency, and Relational Extractivism in Contemporary Amazonia is a fascinating read if you want to get a little bit deeper into this. Really well done. So she brings up a couple of points and uses the example of cinchona, Peruvian bark, which is the source of quinine, as a way of kind of exploring these concepts. In traditional Amazonia, the cinchona tree is alive. It is connected not just to people, but to all the species that it comes into contact with. It's a grandmother tree that has spiritual power, it has physical power. Um, the name of this researcher is Karen Shiratori, and you can find a link to her paper at the bottom of this slide, which I think we'll share after this talk. So you'll find all of the information later. So cinchona in a traditional indigenous worldview is, yes, a plant, but also a very wise, curious, effective being that has preferences. It has thoughts of its own. It has stuff it wants to get done. And we are sort of peers or maybe children to this tree who has incredible capacity to tend and steward the Amazonian system as a whole. And it's effective and active not simply because of the quinine it contains, but because of the relationships, its eco-relations that it has stewarded with people, with other animals, with other plants, with mushrooms, with the entire ecological system in which this tree finds itself as sort of a capstone species. So Dr. Shiratori would say, Cinchona is intelligent, but, and this I think is fascinating, she really pushes back. I don't know if you all have been seeing this, right? Western academic science is getting super interested with plant intelligence. You have amazing researchers like Dr. Monica Galliano, and Paulo Lutz. There's a range of research going on that tracks like the movement of ions across channels in plants and how they communicate damage from one part of the plant to the other. How the root tip acts as an integrator brain that coordinates growth and mycorrhizal connection and almost acts as like a neuron by sending signals back and forth from root tip to root tip. People are training plants in experiments that normally mice would be subjected to about how to navigate mazes. And they're finding that plants can navigate mazes. And so people say, wow, plants are intelligent. And I will say, yes, plants are intelligent, but I would agree with Dr. Shiratori that it's not that they have an intelligence like I have a personal intelligence. The intelligence of plants is a connected, distributed intelligence that really requires and involves all of its relations in the local place, which includes the people and the animals there. And that intelligence is about a process that coordinates those relations, balances their harmonious interactivity, and allows them to be co-creative participants. That's really the intelligence of plants, and that's the traditional intelligence and indigenous intelligence that Dr. Shiratori is talking about. It doesn't mean that plants aren't, as individuals, capable of navigating mazes, which kind of blows my mind, right? It's really cool. But more profoundly, they're these deep coordinators of ecological intelligence, right? She also talks about this concept of relational extractivism to say, I have a relationship with this plant, and I'm going to say, I'm going to put, bookmarks on it or bookends on it. And it starts here and it ends here, and I know what that relationship is, and I'm going to call it this. I'm going to call my knowledge of the species Cinchona officinalis with a Latin binomial. I'm going to call the knowledge of its medicinal activity the active constituent quinine. And actually, I'm going to physically extract that quinine and sell it as a medicine. This is all stuff that human beings have done and often do with plants, and I get it. But relational extractivism leads to something that is very different from grounded plant intelligence. Doesn't mean quinine can't and didn't help with malaria, but what you find is that the sustainable ability to handle malaria actually goes out the window if you extract and refine quinine. We're starting to see the same thing with Artemisia annua, where artemisinin is now being isolated as an antimalarial drug by itself, and we're now starting to see resistance develop, where resistance never developed with traditional antimalarial protocols that used whole sweet Annie, whole Artemisia annua. So Dr. Shiratori literally says, plants reemerge as active protagonists in our lives, in our world, when they are not reduced to passive botanical raw material through relational extractivism. So plants are not a botanical name, a set of chemicals, or a product. What they are is curious, alive, willful, participatory. They reach out to us all the time. Why? Because they have to. That's the way they are in the world. They have to connect to animals by offering gifts like nectar, all of the food upon which we sustain ourselves, and more. Honoring that and acknowledging it shifts the mindset from one of relational extractivism to participatory co-creation. And Of course, traditional indigenous herbal wisdom has always brought us to that place. But I love that Dr. Shiratori, along with others, are now bringing it into the academic mindset, right? And into the academic world. So this interactivity of grounded, rooted plants and people who treat them as aware, alive, participatory beings, right? How, when we interact with these plants, whether it's in a clinical setting or whether it's in the forest or in our gardens, create new stories? How does it, by engaging all of this literal physical memory inside of us, the patterns in our tissues and in our cells expect plants, right? We don't magically have an endocannabinoid system. We don't magically respond to volatile oils the way our muscle and our nerves respond to volatile oils. Part of the reason that we respond to bitter compounds the way we do is because plants guided the formation of our cell receptors and of our liver's detoxification systems. That's why, right? So these are very ancient stories that plants help us remember and retell. And as herbalists, how do we tell these stories now in the modern world? And can they change our minds? What really is our mind? That's kind of the next question that I want us to just think about. Mind and mindset, like what really is it? This paper, again, this comes from academic researchers in the field of medicine, including Dr. Angela Crum. This is published in the Handbook of Clinical Neurology, the new edition. So this is like how they're training medical students now. And it specifically talks about the placebo effect, which is something we've all heard of, right? Sometimes you can give someone a sugar pill and it acts like a medicine and it shifts something inside of them and the pattern changes, right? So what these folks in this paper describe is that if we want to sort of summarize our mind as like our attention or things we're focusing on, our affect, right? Our feelings, what our mood is, our behavior, meaning how we act or show up or do things in the world, and our physiology, like what's going on with the soma, right? That's actually all part of mind. And beyond that, doesn't exist inside, let alone this like skull thing. Even beyond that, it doesn't only exist inside this skin bag, it exists as part of a social, cultural context. And they stop there in this paper, right? They're like, our families, our societies, and their expectation, our cultural expectations, the role of the physician, right, in the context of dispensing a medicine, right? Those have really powerful effects on our mind, which means our attention, our affect, our behavior, and our physiology. And this helps explain the placebo effect, right? It's not just necessarily our mindset, but it's the ability of the world around us, including the physician for these folks, to shift our mindset. Okay? And so by telling a simple story like stress trains you to be more amazing versus stress kills you slowly over time and there's nothing you can do about it, puts people in a really different place. So I will say this, even just using words, a healer has the ability to shift a mind. And if we can shift a mind, right? You go back to Dr. Bach and talking about the Bach flower essences. If you can shift a mind, often the physiology follows. But what I'm telling you is that because mind and physiology are totally the same thing, if you engage in the chemistry of communion that medicinal plants provide, you are even more powerfully affecting mindset. And I think that's partly because I can tell a story with words and that's great. But people listen and they think about my story. Plants bypass that. I call it the biosemiotic bypass, right? It's a way for the ecology and for the natural world to literally get a mindset shifting intervention into a human being without having to convince the human through a long, elaborate tale that speaks to their mind. Do you all see how different that is? And potentially how powerful it is? If we feel that mind and body are the same thing, and that this physical expression is really just an expression of an ancient mind, right? Perhaps encoded through DNA and expressed in my physical body. We can speak to our mind and shift our mindset with substances that aren't mental, that aren't books or thought or ideas, but that are physical. And if you can do that with a placebo through verbal storytelling in a clinical setting, how much more powerfully can you do that when you overlay on top of that verbal storytelling this sort of flux of information in the form of chemistry and feeling and taste and sensory expression and the beauty that plants have. You layer that all on top. Wow, that's so deep. Okay? To give you an example of this, I'll tell this story, which I tell a lot, really briefly. I had a guy in clinic, and he was actually probably convinced to come to talk to me by someone else. He was a little bit skeptical, old Vermonter. And, he's basically got like this constant GI inflammation and heartburn and irritation that he's complaining about. And, I talked to him for a little while. Like, he likes to go out and work on his backhoe. He's like very physical and, yeah, hardworking guy, but gets a lot of heartburn. We talk about diet a little bit. He's like, I don't really want to change my diet. I'm like, okay. Let's try this. I'd like to give you a little dandelion tincture. Don't worry about anything. Just take that dandelion tincture a couple times a day, do a full teaspoon of it before you eat. We'll talk in a week, see how it goes. And in a week, he came back to me and was like, I'm taking a lot less Tums, and things feel a little bit better. I'm like, oh, yeah, let's keep going. Let's keep going. We got to give it at least another couple weeks. So at the 1 month follow up, he comes back and is like, I'm not really taking much Tums at all. And I'm still just taking that dandelion, right, a couple times a day before my meals. Is that really all I have to do? I'm like, well, it sounds like it's helping. He's like, it is. I'll keep going. But he said, I have another question for you, which is, are these the same dandelions that grow in my yard? I'm like, yeah, yeah, it's probably not the exact same ones, but it's the same species, right? It's Taraxacum officinale. It's not native to this country, but boy, did it take over when it came here. And yeah, these are the same plants. And he just doesn't miss a beat. And he tells me, well, geez, I better stop spraying Roundup on them. And like that to me is what we're talking about, right? That's the upstream thinking that happens when you engage with the mind of herbs as they flow through your body. You receive this benefit from them. It shifts your mind and mindset, and you don't even know it's happening. How long would it have taken me to convince the guy not to spray Roundup using my words, right? It probably wouldn't have happened. But for dandelion, it was this super easy thing, just took its time and not only adjusted the physiology, which was the central goal, but had this incredible side effect of deeply shifting this person's mindset. And I am sure you have seen this, sometimes even without physical plant intervention, by just telling a story about plants to someone. And whether they really fully realize it or not, their mindset shifts, right? So I would like to introduce you to this idea, the theory of constructed emotion. If you're like me, you grew up thinking that like there's a fear center in our brain, right? And it's maybe the amygdala. We can map out those neurons. Whenever someone feels fear, it activates this part of the brain. Fear exists as a pattern in the brain, and it's universal. And not only that, whenever someone's afraid, they will make this afraid face, and all these physiologic things will happen. When they're anxious or happy or in love, they'll make the same faces, and the same things will happen physiologically. Emotion is hardwired, affect is hardwired. What Lisa Feldman Barrett has, and like she's been working on this for 2 decades and is a prominent world-renowned neurologist, right? What she's been finding, and through anthropological research, for example, is that there's not universal signs for emotion. And that when you show someone a scared face in a different part of the world, they might actually interpret it as something totally different. Um, what she's come down to is that, and I love this story. I'll just tell you a brief story that she recounts. She's like, I went on a blind date and I'm sitting and I'm talking to this guy and I'm feeling this like feeling, right? I'm like, ooh, there's like butterflies in my stomach. I must be really into this person. Like I feel like alive and I feel tingly and okay. And after the dinner, they said goodbye and she went back home and she resolved to like call him back the next day and really like follow up on what seemed like a really amazing relationship. Later on, that evening, she woke up and had this like raging fever and started vomiting violently because she had like a stomach bug that she had gotten like maybe the day before or something like that. And that's what she was feeling when she was sitting down and having her blind date. But because of the context, she interpreted that physical sensation as sort of relationship excitement. The point being, it's very difficult for us to fully understand exactly why our mind and our body are doing what they do. And we make up these elaborate stories, which we consider to be very real and true thoughts of our own about why we feel certain ways. And I bring this up only to say that what Dr. Barrett has come to is this idea that emotions are constructed, not innate or inherent, which means that what we feel is a reflection. And I like this little diagram on the side, right, from her work of like where we are in terms of the time of day, what kind of workload we have, what's on our schedule, and what's in our local community. And I love that she put a planet there too, right? What influences are coming to us from the outside world? And this guy's thought about dandelion and how he better not spray Roundup on it, and the shift from feeling that Roundup is awesome to feeling that Roundup is and having a different emotional reaction to it, that came to be because his emotional picture now had dandelion as a co-constructor, which it didn't have before. So what I'm trying to say is we really identify strongly with our thoughts, with our feelings, with our affect, right? But way more often than not, our thoughts and feeling and affect coming from sources and influences inside us and outside us that we really don't fully understand. And so just to step back and kind of say, hey, again, this is not news to any of you, I'm sure. See that feeling, recognize it moving by, but don't necessarily think that that is you coming up with that feeling. Think of it more as a signpost from the world telling you something interesting. And when you reframe affect and feeling that way, not only does it have less of a hold on you, but it allows inroads for creation and creativity from other different sources, right? We behave, we have will, we have agency, we move and create in the world. The world takes form as a result of this. But what if the things that drive our behavior, our feelings and our affect, are not entirely our own, right? What if they're constructed from the world inside us, our microbiome, the state of our tissues, and the world outside us, our friends, our family, our culture, our jobs, our gardens, our tea? Which is why I keep on my desk, front and center, this little plaque, which maybe you can see, that says, are your thoughts even your thoughts? Just to remind me that what I think is so cool, I need to just relax, let that flow by, and see where the next step takes me. So what if dandelion can be part of this? What does that mean for us as herbalists? What does that mean for us as human animals on this planet? That's what I think the real gift of herbalism is. Because it's one thing to understand that this occurs, right? Dr. Barrett has articulated it really well. Folks who talk about meditative practices have articulated it very well. People who engage in psychedelic experiences and come out of it with very interesting histories have articulated it really well. But what herbalism gives us is not just a way to be aware of this, but a process for once we realize it's true that our thoughts are not entirely ours and that the world inside and outside of us has deep impact on them, how to engage with that world in a way that enhances this relational process, builds attunement, allows for greater resiliency and participatory involvement and engagement, because that's what the world wants of us, right? It wants us to be healthy so we can co-create. That's what herbalism can teach us, and that's what I've spent, I think, at least the last decade trying to put my notes together from clinical work, from what I understand about herbal science and phytopharmacology, what I understand about traditional practices of relationality and gift giving and how that works, and help distill out of what I've learned from plants and herbal medicine a process science, a process art for building creativity through relational engagement, which really is just what plants have taught me. And I'm just trying to say it's not a thing, but it's a process, and that it changes our minds in deep and profound ways, sometimes even in ways that we're not fully aware of. So I'll end with this other amazing paper, you all. These folks, Keith Williams and Adrian and Bernard, Nova Scotia herbalist, deeply connected to indigenous medicine from that part of the world. They just came out with a paper. I haven't read it yet, but I love the title. I'm going to go check it out this week as soon as I possibly can. And the title is this: Skin Contains Lands and Birds. And I love that, right? Our skin, which we think of as a barrier, it, it doesn't end there. Our barrier actually doesn't exist. Skin contains land and birds. Land and birds are us. There's this deep interplay. And we exist as individuals to be able to not be perfectly matched to that deep interplay, but still have our own individual flavor. And that allows us to participate and potentially add something new to this deep relational dance that the world is constantly engaged in. We're valuable and important in there, but only if we realize that we are one of many voices threading this new braid, right, through the world as we participate in it. But to bring it back to this paper, you all have heard of the doctrine of signatures. Is this idea that plants like chamomile, right, can show features like the chamomile flower that look like physical structures in our body. Chamomile flower looks like an eye, therefore chamomile is good for eyes. And yeah, chamomile is great for soothing eyes. Just make sure you have good filter paper around that chamomile so you don't get any stuff in your eyeball when you put that chamomile on there. But yeah, it's fantastic for it. But, you know, people have poo-pooed the doctrine of signatures because people used to think that hepatica leaves that look like liver are good for the liver, but really it's toxic, et cetera, et cetera. So those crazy herbalists, like, what are they thinking? What this paper shows us is that it's not about what science really loves, which is these hard and fast correspondences that never change, but that the doctrine of signatures is a personal encoding of meaning from the world. And, you know, they use the word ecosemiotic, and I want to break that down. Semiosis is the science of symbols, right? Which is a science of communication. Language is a type of semiotics, but so are like flags that you wave, right? So are like physical expressions. And the point here is that the signs and symbols we see as plants, as individuals, that provide meaning for us and help us tell a story that builds this bond, right? You see a chamomile flower, you're like, wow, that looks like an eye. That's a gift from chamomile. You file that away, you try chamomile on someone's eye, it helps. You're like, oh, wow, I really got it. Chamomile spoke to me. And this signature of the flower is how I remember that bond, right? But the point is that it's not a fixed story that is the same for everyone everywhere, but it's an evolving story in which your affect, your connection, your personal relationship with that plant when you experienced it is encoded in this ecosemiotic layer, right? So over time, the doctrine of signatures, especially as part of an oral tradition and storytelling, was modified, you know, as grandmother told grandkid and grandkid came up with their own sort of flair and flavor attachment to that. That is what the doctrine of signatures is. It's a relational process rather than a set of fixed correspondences, right? A relational process that tells us we can literally see and sometimes taste and feel and experience meaning from the natural world as signs and signals expressed in plants. And that as we build that catalog, whether we're writing it in our herbal grimoire, right, or we're singing songs or making art that reminds us of those alignments and connections, we are building this ecosemiotic layer of meaning that knits together all the kingdoms of the natural world. What they also talk about, right, because again, Adrienne and Bernard is deeply connected to indigenous communities and worldviews. She talks about the old growth mind as a literal term that is used in the First Nations communities with which they work about what it's like when you're an herbalist who feels connected. You have this old growth mind that reflects what the forest is thinking. And you might say, like, how can my mind think like a forest? It's not going to think exactly like a forest, but by opening yourself up to this meaning making pattern relational process from the natural world, you are building a set of language layers that allow you to express forest mind through a human. So, no, you're not actually the mind of the forest. I don't think I could hold all of that as a human being. But I can let old growth mind work through me and have my thoughts be deeply entangled by that old growth mind so that my behavior and action and agency are no longer the behavior and action and agency of a human who simply has maybe a Cheetos and chicken nuggets mind. The authors of that paper, Skin Contains Lands and Birds, are the same authors of this paper, Keith Williams and Adrienne Ann Bedard. So you can look up the authors and the title of that paper if you want to get to the text of it later on. The other process that these authors identify is not just the old growth mind as sort of a static thing, but this idea of lyric thought. And you all might have felt this in clinic. Maybe when a plant story comes to you or a plant spirit comes to you and you're like, all of a sudden you just start talking, right? Or maybe you're in the garden and you're having a conversation with the plant and you just start talking and you start hearing things and you start talking back to the plant. Or maybe that happens in the forest and maybe you're watching a sunset on a stone and all of a sudden you're compelled to say something or feel something or a story comes to mind. They describe this as lyric thought, which is not a static thought, but is something that flows and changes with the environment in which you find yourself as you relate to that environment. And that you and the environment think together, dream together into a new emergent future. I actually had the privilege of doing this work with 6 of my colleagues in the desert just really less than 3 weeks ago. The desert was blooming, ocotillo and brittle-bush and prickly pear and the barrel cactuses all were putting their flowers out. Creosote bush was flowering, chaparral. Friend of mine, Ben, who grew up in Arizona and knows the desert well, said like, hey, Guido, have you ever smelled chaparral when it rains in the desert? And I confessed to him I had not. And I bemoaned like what sounded like an amazing thing. And we took our time in the desert. We did what we called plant sits, where we would go off and we would just let plants guide us, tell us a song, tell us a story. And we'd come back to the group and we'd share. And wouldn't you know that the themes that came up always resonated? We all felt the same thing because this place mind, this plant mind, was speaking through us, this old growth mind. In this case, it was desert old growth, right? And Monday morning, before we got ready to pack up and leave, this gentle rain started coming down. And I got to actually smell what my friend Ben was telling me. And it was amazing. It was amazing. So that story lives inside me and guides my thoughts and will forever. Do the ocotillo and agave, are they speaking to you now or is it me? I sometimes have a hard time figuring that out. And I don't care. I frankly don't care. I don't need to disentangle what comes from where. What I do need to do is engage in this process of ongoing relation with my plant kin and with places, because I know that that will temper my thinking, balance my internal rhythms and my thoughts, and set me on a track that is way more resilient and mindful than I would be if plants were not by my side, and if these amazing places did not get a chance to tell their story through me. Okay? So one of the things that this paper really brought home to me is that agency and will, what we think of as like uniquely human, right? We have domain over the world because we are the smartest and we're the only ones who have free will, right? I really don't buy it, you all. First of all, I don't think our will is truly free because of the theory of a constructed emotion. We are literally controlled by things that we often don't see. And I think that if we recognize this fact that will exists throughout the universe and mind is baked into the most fundamental parts of the universe, then what we're doing is not thinking, we're participating in this evolving, never ending story, and we're doing it together. And you can do it together with whatever you want. I'm just here to argue that plants are amazing at guiding storytelling. And they've been doing it for way before there were animals on this planet. They literally created oxygen, which didn't used to exist on this planet, and reshaped the biosphere in an incredibly profound way. They're doing it to this day. Let's plug in there. Let's plug in there, especially as we move forward in our sort of excited technological advances, which are still a product of nature, right? Let's do it by supporting a balanced spirit and mind through engagement with plants and through following meaning and signs that we see throughout the world. There is no training needed to join this process. It's built into us. Plants are trying and are super patient. They're trying to connect with us, though. They always have been, and they always will. When plants connect with us, it catalyzes a process, which is a process of making a new story and creating a new form. And what this means is if story and form, if plants and physical chemistry they contain actually is storytelling, then the fixing, quote unquote, of tissues, the rearrangement of what goes on in our soma is as much storytelling as putting a thought into your head. Okay? It's mind, but it is physical too. And when we engage in this process, we become empowered. And this is the only source, you all, of creativity. This is where creativity comes from, through relational engagement with each other, with plants, with anything we come across. I just have found by engaging with plants, I get to be a lot more mindful and present in all of the other engagements I do because plants are so darn good at balancing me out, keeping me from being a stampeding buffalo, right? And chilling out the sometimes very childless, immature excitement that y'all can probably hear in my voice as I talk about these ideas with you. Without plants, I would be spun out who knows where and not really able to ground that story in a meaningful way. So this is a quote from Adrienne Ann Bedard. The forms and patterns of the natural world, particularly the botanical world, offer a near infinite range of communicative pathways in the plant-human ecosymbiotic relationship. What this means is if you're trying to build story, walk outside and go to the first plant that draws you. There will be an endless well of stories there, and the creativity and feeling of empowerment that comes from this is truly the deepest nourishment that I, as a human being, have experienced. And I think it's the root of all healing, you all. We can get very specific and fancy with the herbs we use, but this is the deepest part. And without it, I'm afraid that we get to that place that the German researchers were bemoaning, right? Where we're really interested in herbs, but we're not engaging or relating or deeply seeing them as true storytellers that are active, curious, engaged participants. I hope that makes sense. So really just briefly to end, our herbal practice, right? This can be a clinical practice that you engage in. This can be a very personal practice that's only you. It can be how you take care of your family. It can be a way that you make solstice presents for your friends, and that's all. But whatever it is, it's your practice. Herbs embody stories. These are both super ancient stories that they have been telling for since before we were human. And every time you join in, because you're new and it's important that your uniqueness be added to this, a new story is born. We can tell stories without words by just connecting people with plants like mugwort. Herbs are not commodities, they're not resources, they're not even drugs or medicines. What they are is beings, and they're trying to reach out to us, and they use all the tools and languages at their disposal to do so. If we reduce them, right, to a botanical name or a constituent or a product, you're just cutting off those relational channels. There's still some, but they're not as rich as they could be. But when we engage, and that doesn't mean that you have to garden. It doesn't mean that you have to go spend time in the forest. It maybe means that you practice some botanical drawing. It maybe means that you create music. Anything that creates engagement around your experiences in the natural world, which can include an urban garden or a dandelion growing out of a crack in the sidewalk. All of this opens up way more channels. And the more channels you have, as we'll see when we look at the process more, the more channels you have, the more options you have. And that translates directly to resilience, creativity, and health, right? Our mindsets shift, all of it, not just the mind, but the physical part too, because they're one and the same. And we begin to embody a new story that has a crucial new element. As humans, we don't have to walk alone. We never actually have been. But now we know that the world is reaching out to us as modern humans. The traditional knowledge, the indigenous knowledge that we've always had, people are starting to say, wait a second, maybe there's something to this. Maybe it's not primitive, but maybe it can be primitive and sophisticated at the same time. And regardless, it holds this really deep wisdom. And rather than being about a specific thing you do, it's more about a process of engagement with the specifics growing out of that uniquely, like the unique doctrine of signatures correspondences that people come up with on a case by case basis. So what does that mean? We can look at herbs that grab our attention. And this is part of like my gift cycle process, right? You can start with initiation processes. What plants awaken you today? This opens your mind. And as we've seen from psychedelic research, it opens what's called a critical learning window, where your mind is not only open, but you're able to actually stitch together new patterns, where before you're kind of locked into whatever your existing patterns were. So first of all, and plants are so good at this, right? There's some tobacco, there's some rue, you name it. Plants grab us, even if it's just the beauty of a flower. That's an initiatory experience. It grabs your attention. Often then there's this opening and people have questions, right? So after I had this sort of connection to St. John's wort and she was like, hey, pay attention. I was trying to like hear and understand and I couldn't. So I went to my opening herbs and yarrow was right there. And I was like, oh, take a little yarrow and chew it. And all of a sudden I opened up, right? And I could begin to feel certain options a little more, and I could start to hear the message St. John's wort was trying to give to me a little more clearly, right? This is no coincidence. Why do we use these herbs for incense, which is often used in future seeing or divination? Why is yarrow, like the yarrow stock, fundamental I Ching, fortune telling, casting method? Why was yarrow chosen for that? I really think it's because these opening herbs not only literally open us up to seeing new possibilities when we're in that critical learning period that was opened by the initiatory experience, they also relax us so we can kind of get out of that sympathetic overdrive fight or flight place and be open to those new possibilities. And then, this is the place where I often see myself falter. You have to do the work. You have to do the work. And this is where the tonics come in and why I think the tonics are so valuable in herbal medicine. And, if we can get a little deeper into tonification, I would want to share with you the journey that I want people to go on before they start using tonics. so that we can start shifting their mindset so that they're ready to receive the sort of deep rebalancing gifts that tonics can offer. How to use them in cycles, right? Along with those initiatory and opening herbs as part of this process of gift giving, of listening and learning, of doing the hard work, of actually stitching together a new pattern, of tying in a new braid, right? That takes work, it takes time. Tonics help support us in that process. And so you can layer in these herbs to your protocol at the right times to catalyze and facilitate the journey of the person you're working with or your own journey as you progress through the gift cycle, right? And ultimately, as the gift economies that, Adrienne and Bernard talks about, and that are so deeply rooted in sort of the indigenous worldview, what you'll find is that you will get strong enough to give out your own gifts, which is the whole point, right? Receiving, giving, and allowing that flow to continue. This creates fractal complexity and beauty in the world. In fact, everything we have now is a response to that gift cycle of creativity. Plants are deeply intelligent at managing that process for us. And herbalism, as a very ancient traditional art, has really incredible knowledge about how to make that happen. It's a process, and it is one that is very simple, but still takes work. But what I found is that this gift cycle that plants have taught me not only has shifted my mindset in terms of experiencing the world, but has given me some really practical tools that I can use to kind of assess, okay, what part of the cycle is this person in? What part of the cycle is this organization in? What part of the cycle is the herbal products industry in? How can we create an initiatory experience here? Because you all, my perspective, which I've learned from plants, is simply this. There's really only mind. And physical form is an established, deeply conserved habit of mind. If we change our minds, we change the world. And if the world changes, it can change our minds because it's all one continuum. The process of building novelty and creativity is a gift giving and receiving process that generates bonds of connection and deep conserved relationship, which allows for novelty to emerge, for health and healing to emerge, and for a balanced stewardship of renewal to continue in the natural world. I really think this is what herbalism has taught me, and I'd love to share more with you, right? So this is a way of looking at the healing process: initiation, opening, and integration. A cycle, which is a cycle of gifts. We don't only tell stories with words, but herbs can help reinforce those ideas too, right? So we can externalize that story. And what this does, you all, do you know how when you have a really good habit in place or a really good routine in place, like you don't have to think about it anymore? For me, it's like running. I don't have to think about running. I know where my running clothes are. I can be super groggy in the morning. I throw those things on. I, go out and I start running. And I know what will happen is I will feel more engaged, more excited. It'll take care of my cardiovascular health. It'll set me straight for the day. But I don't have to think about that at all. I don't have to motivate myself. It's a habit and a routine. So what happens when we turn to plants as part of this gift cycle? We help externalize facets of our mind that normally would take a lot of energy to keep going. And as a result, plants literally prop us up. They take straw off of the camel's back, and we end up feeling stronger, more resilient to actually be able to shine our own light because we're not as weighted down by these processes that we're trying to take care of everything else. We can offload some of that to plants, believe it or not. And they can change our mindset, our physical environment, and our bodies as well. This means that we now don't need as much energy to be even more resilient than we were the day before. And we add our own chapter to the ongoing evolution of the story. So many ways of doing this, right? We can leave herbal offerings. We can create our herbal grimoire. We can have a ritual that we have for people, when guests come to my house or when I want to meet someone in town. I'm like, we'll meet, but I would love to do it over pu'er tea. I'm going to tell you about the tea. I'm going to take time with like pouring the infusion. We're going to sip it. We're going to talk about how it makes us feel. We're really going to bring plants to the table. And I like to do that in a ritualized and ceremonial way. Just like this little picture of me and Rosemary having a little bit of butterfly pea tea together. Like the way she sets out the flowers, the way she sets out the tablecloth, the way she picks the teapot and the mugs. All of this is intentional, and all of this is externalized mind that helps guide our interaction. So now imagine you all, if herbs were in the boardroom, if herbs were in the halls of Congress, if we ended up being able to create processes and rituals of externalized mind that brought this gift cycle of the tonic herbs into every facet of our lives. I think rather than specific one-off wonders like milk thistle or turmeric or you name it, it's this relational idea of bringing plants, whatever they may be, the ones that speak to you, into our lives and into our power centers as human beings to help guide the new turn of our spiral. I'm a big believer in humans, but I trust them a lot more if they have plants by their side. So that's really what I wanted to share with you this evening. As always, I've gone way over, even though I was like, Abby, I'm going to keep this to 40 minutes. Um, Through storytelling, we make the world. We make mindset. We catalyze attunement. Plants, by bypassing our dogma and the ruts of patterns that we get stuck in, they're unique allies in this pursuit. And if we engage through our herbal practice, we heal not just ourselves, but we heal all our relations. I think this is what herbal medicine offers. This is what I've learned from plants. This is why I'm excited to be a part of our community as herbalists. And I'd love to get into a deeper conversation with you all about how you've experienced this, how it shows up in your life, and how we can evolve this new future together, right? Um, because we need it. So thank you for listening.
Let me ask a couple questions before we move into the talking about the program. One of the things that's coming up in my mind, I don't know about other people, but this phenomenon we call ego.
Mm.
And especially, when I was a young, right out of chiropractic school practitioner, you have this desire to prove yourself or prove.
Karis, you just muted yourself by mistake.
I did. You have this desire and need to, I mean, you're very wrapped up in your ego and your healing capacity. So I just was wondering, are are we letting go of our ego? Is this like sort of a Buddhist approach?
I think that is a great question. What I found in living systems is that if you really want to super simplify it, right, we can talk about this sort of playful, outward, expansive, relational drive, right? We want to eat, we want to meet, we want to hear, we want to learn, we want to explore. And this sort of like protective, lockdown, I am me and I don't want to die side. And I will
Mhm.
say both are essential in my experience for a successful, resilient living system. And we can talk about the sort of yin idea of, exploring outward and being dreamy. We can talk about the yang idea of the sympathetic nervous system and locking everything down, right? They're both essential. And what I don't want to do is just become part of the universal consciousness. If I'm just part of a universal consciousness, first of all, though mind may be in everything and foundational, there's also these individual nexuses of mind. And without that, we would all be perfectly resonant with everything. And I'm
Mm.
trying to tell you that won't work. We need that slight imperfection in order to be able to not have perfect resonance, because it's through that imperfection that novelty is born. If we just perfectly resonate with each other in the world, nothing new will happen. We'll just sit in this perfect resonance place. But if we're close, right? If we're really close, but not perfectly aligned, then we have the chance to create something new. And so the idea of the ego as a process whereby we maintain self-integrity is really important because if I didn't have my individual perspective, then when I connect with plants, I wouldn't be able to create a new chapter to that story. And in
Mhm.
order for me to have my perspective, I have to have a sense of self. And I have to be able to maintain boundaries effectively. Does that make sense? Because otherwise,
Yes.
I am going to be overtaken, subsumed, and no longer have that piece of individual uniqueness that is so important to create something new in the world. So I think we, while mind is universal, separate and fragment into individual prisms so that we can actually start creating novelty together. And the
Mhm.
reason that we don't have just an undifferentiated whole is because this sort of fractal complexity of the world is actually a lot better at creating and allowing energy to flow through things. So a big block of metal is not as good at dissipating heat as a convoluted radiator is. And think of my personal ego as one of those folds in the radiator, right? Your ego and
Yeah.
my ego together, uniting with plants, will sort of move that flow of thought and mind into new creative spaces better than if we were like egoless and in this one undifferentiated soup. So I actually think that's a really important point.
I love that. That sort of goes into the next thing I was thinking about. It seems from what you're saying that we don't necessarily have to ingest plants to get their healing benefit.
I don't think that we do.
Yeah.
I think if we've never experienced the plant or even heard about it, it might be difficult for that plant to come to us. But I've even heard stories of plants that have come to people who have never read about it, never seen it, never heard about it, right? And if we truly believe that mind is fundamental and the relational process is what it is at its core, then sort of communication beyond space and time doesn't seem as weird as it might if we think that my mind is separate from your mind, right? Um, I certainly think that ingesting plants adds this whole other layer that connects the physical expression of mind to another physical expression of mind, but it certainly is not, quote, necessary. Um, I've even had plant experiences. Well, I had heard about them, but only barely. And then they would come to me in dreams, and then I would see them the next day. And often because I am who I am, then that's spurred me to actually ingest them, right? Because I really love that part of being able to put that into my body and the physical connection. But I really don't think that is necessary or essential for
Yeah.
this work to occur.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my, I mean, the wow moment that I was thinking of at the beginning of this class was a time when I was staying with my parents and I wasn't feeling well and I was very tired, really just deeply tired and couldn't get off the couch. And the elderflower was blooming on their property and I wanted to harvest it. And I kept procrastinating and procrastinating and I finally got my clippers and trudged down the end of the driveway and got right in this giant bush and I was in it, in the thick of it. And the branches were, on me and all around me and the fragrance
Hmm.
and within minutes I was transformed. I mean, I was completely re-energized and felt myself again. And it was for me, it was really magical. And that was a time in my life when I didn't really think that kind of thing could happen. So it
Hmm.
wasn't like I was even looking for it.
And elder is, I think she's done that to a lot of folks, myself included.
Mhm.
No ingestion necessary, but you get under those flowers. Anyway, that's really cool, Karis.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of felt like my ancestors were with me. That was the sense I got, this elder sort of ancestor feeling of being guided. So I'd like to shift into a few questions that we have if you've got the energy for us.
Okay.
Um, so Maury says, at the beginning you said that plants are smarter than people. I loved how you talked about this historical symbiosis of people and plants. Humans have helped plants throughout time. Your Alps example illustrated this beautifully. Things are obviously way different in modern times, but do you think that plants are smarter than people in totality?
Well, um, it depends kind of what scale you're looking at. I think if you take the human species as a whole, um, and you take the green world as a whole, the ability to regulate, balance, and provide safe sustainability, I think plants are much better at that. So
Hmm.
it depends what you mean by smarter. I think
Hmm.
we can come up with rocket ships. I don't know that a plant has come up with a rocket ship, but it certainly has come up with some interesting seed distribution rockets and other things like that. But just again, to just push a button, right? What if our job is to create rocket ships so that plants can colonize other worlds? And what if plants are feeding us all of this sugar, right? So that we can be strong enough to be able to actually do that effectively for them. I don't know, is the point. I tend to think that plants have a wider, longer arc of wisdom than I do as a human being. And I don't know if that means that they're smarter or not. I think maybe we should just say that they are wiser.
I like that. Like that word. Alicia says, can you say more about how our skin isn't really a barrier, and that includes plants and birds, etc.?
What I mean by that is, if you use the skin as the metaphor for our separation, um, then by saying, that the the skin is birds and trees and fields and streams, what you're saying is that while you might have an edge and that edge is important, ultimately you are a reflection of all your relations. And as that flows through you, you change in ways that sometimes you don't even fully understand. So to say that your skin is actually a barrier that separates you might be, it's real in one sense, but in another sense, it's a little bit of an illusion. But
Hmm.
as we were saying before, Karis, it's important to have that individual separation because without it, there's no chance for imperfection. And without imperfection, there's no learning or growth. There really isn't. And so resonance exists, but it's never perfect.
Hmm.
And what that means is that our skin can let all of this world through, but at the same time, also give us a little bit of a sense of self that is important to maintain. So we contain multitudes, we can connect with multitudes, and multitudes contain us, but we also have a barrier. And I actually think that's important. I don't know, Alicia, if that really answers what you said. I want to read that paper.
Hmm. Yeah. Makes me think about my daughter was in science class. They were talking about how there's space between everything. And she said, I'm sitting on this chair and it doesn't feel like any space to me. And so she has this illusion that there's no space between her and the chair. But in fact, we know that there is,
Right.
right? So our skin is a barrier, but it's also quite permeable. Hmm. Um, Laura says, is chaparral a specific plant or a variety of plants?
Um, I am a northeastern US and Italian Alps expert, but as far as I understand from the desert plant experts, there's a lot of different species of chaparral, not just Laurea tridentata. So there's a few different ones at least, and I have heard people talk about it sort of monolithically as like chaparral or creosote bush, but I know that there are subtleties, different speciations in different regions. But as far as I've heard, Tridentata is the most common, and all of them can somewhat be used interchangeably.
Hmm. Pamela's wondering, besides yarrow, what other herbs can open up your mind to the connection of plants? Or
Well,
was
that's what I
yarrow
wanted.
your intuitive plant?
that's what I want to talk a little more about. When we have a little more time together, is those opening plants. But there's a few different ones, and a lot of them are aromatic. I love linden, but I also love Danshen, Salvia miltioryza, or red root sage. I think that really opens too, and it crosses a little over into tonic. But so does hawthorn, and hawthorn is another one too. And like hawthorn leaf and flower can be another amazing sort of opener like that. Um, they're different from the initiatory ones in that they don't like slam you on the head the way like psilocybin or salvia divinorum or some of these really potent plants like tobacco or datura do. But what they do is like chill you out a little bit so that you can harness that sort of fertile time that occurs after the aha moment when we are way more flexible than we would be otherwise. Those are
There
just
was,
some.
yeah. Gabriella says, Canyon live oak came to me in meditation. Do you know about them? They're energy medicine. I love them. And in Mexico, we have a lot.
I have met a few, but I definitely don't have the relational depth and connection that I can kind of hear even in just that comment. Um, so maybe one day I can visit and spend a little more time with someone
Mm.
who can be a guide for me.
And then our final question, Michael says, I may have missed this. What originally stirred Guido's interest in plants? And over the course of your life, when did these insights start to pour in? Did certain mentors really emphasize plant intelligence, or were there other influences? So you did talk
Yeah,
about that somewhat.
I can talk about it briefly, and we'll get into it a little more in the program because it really is also like my journey, to a certain extent. Um,
Hmm.
I was lucky to kind of forage when I was a kid, and foraging in the Alps is like, in retrospect, holy cow, how lucky was I? Um, but plants have always kind of beyond that been something that I've turned to when I felt ungrounded or I felt unsure or I felt alone. Um, we moved around a lot when I was little, and from the States to the US to Italy, and I kind of felt uprooted from time to time, but it didn't matter. Plants were always there. So I kind of, even as a kid, developed this sort of, and so many kids talk about this, right? Like plants in the natural world being their solace, being their retreat, being their space. um, Really, it was a plant that kind of told me like, you're not going to learn what you want to learn at college. And that was like one of the more profound life-changing insights. But even before that, I want to kind of start this whole thing. Like, I love running, I love movement. I think it counteracts my melancholy in an essential way. And the calamus root like catalyzed that for me when I was like 14, 15 years old. And it kind of like changed my life. That tree that talked to me in college and told me to find learning elsewhere changed my life. And like, there's just been a series of those things. I've also always really been interested in story, mythology, philosophy, occult tradition, like the way people think about mind and consciousness and spirit and what is spirit and how does it work. So I've kind of been like studying that stuff. I don't know that I've had a specific mentor, but I've certainly had a range of amazing authors that I've connected with in that realm. And then in the herbal world, that's where like physical, real human beings have been crucial in my journey and development. And it's, folks that you all know like Rosemary, but also like people that have come through herb school that I've gotten a chance to talk to and learn from, colleagues of mine that I work with in the herbal products industry, um, folks like Anna Embrecht from Sustainable Herbs Initiative, and some of my herbal friends here in Vermont, like, Amy Goodman, and just being able to connect with them in a real way about plants validated the experience for me and made me feel like we were all kind of working together, which is, I think, the only way I've been able to sustain this work. Um, so I don't know if there's kind of rambled all over the place on that, but I've been thinking about plants for a
No,
really long
that was
time.
beautiful. That was beautiful. I'm just going to ask one final thing. If you had one best friend who was a plant, who would it be?
Um, I'm really torn um, between my favorite initiatory plant, my favorite opening plant, and my favorite tonic. But maybe I'll just stay with my favorite tonic, which is my best friend and probably the plant I consume the most of, and that's hawthorn.
Mm. Take it every day too.
Yeah.
And I got a nice little one right out in my yard.
Same,
I love
same, same. So I like
love
taking the
it.
hawthorn extract, but I also like making my own tincture and
I
have.
do selfies with my hawthorn. I don't post them anywhere. I just love taking pictures with her. Well, I want to thank everybody who has stayed through this presentation, especially thank you to Guido for sharing just so personally this journey that you've been on for so long. And I'm really excited to go deeper and dive into the tonic way with you and really um, assimilate what we've just touched on this evening. So I'm grateful.
Thanks, Doris. Me too.
Mm.
And yeah, I think I really look forward to hearing what you and what the community sort of what bubbles up and what we come up with together too.
Yeah,
I really will try to do better to not um oh to have space for conversation and questions because I think that's really important.
sounds good. We love listening to you too, though, so don't forget that. We
All
do.
right. Thank you, Karis. Thank you, Abby, and everyone at Botanic Wise for making this happen. Thanks to you all for coming and visiting this evening a little bit together.
Yeah. Everybody, thank you.